Welcome to this live session. My name is Robert Swinney, and I'm an Associate Professor of Operations Management at the Fuqua School of Business. So I'm going to talk this afternoon about operations during the pandemic. I'll discuss some of the impacts of the pandemic on the operations and supply chains of companies and the consequences of those impacts on our day-to-day lives. I'll also talk about what I think the pandemic means for the future of operations and supply chains. So please ask questions in the comments while I'm speaking, and I will get to them at the end if we have time. Okay, so first thing I want to talk about is the toilet paper shortage. So as most of you are well aware, early on in the pandemic, toilet paper was very hard to find on store shelves, along with a lot of other consumer goods. Now, the reason for this wasn't that people are using more toilet paper during the pandemic, most likely. So why did the shortages happen? Now, many have claimed that panic buying from consumers caused the shortages that we saw. Now, panic buying may have happened, but it didn't need to in order to generate the kinds of shortages that we've seen. I think what happened here is that in the wake of stay-at-home orders, there was a shift in consumption from a mixture of at-work and at-home consumption of things like toilet paper to nearly 100% at home. And the toilet paper supply chains for businesses and home use are separate. And this kind of led to immediate stockouts for the retail distribution channel. And it wasn't easy for manufacturers to change over production to retail products or to reroute the supply chain, as the supply chain is what's called an efficient supply chain. So broadly, operations researchers bucket supply chains into two categories: efficient or responsive. Now, efficient supply chains, like the one for toilet paper, are heavily optimized to minimize cost. And often these supply chains are slow. They have long lead times, because speed is sacrificed for operating at a low cost and high efficiency. So you want to use these types of supply chains when demand is very predictable and the industry has low prices or low margins. Now, responsive supply chains, on the other hand, they're optimized to handle highly variable or unpredictable demand patterns. So these kinds of supply chains are often fast and are built to handle surges in demand, but the speed comes at a cost. And these types of supply chains are only profitable when margins are very high. So for example, you see them in fast fashion apparel firms like Zara. Now, toilet paper and many other consumer products have efficient supply chains, and they had trouble adapting to the shift in consumption channel that happened at the start of the pandemic. So that alone could cause serious shortages. And combined with some panic buying, it led to what we've seen with toilet paper and other products that didn't really see an overall demand increase like food items, but still had shortages on the shelves for some time after the start of the pandemic. So fortunately, for products that have experienced a shift in consumption channel, but not an overall increase in demand, it's possible, but costly and slow, to reroute the supply chain to fulfill demand. So this is why many consumer goods are now back in stock and available on store shelves. Now, there's also been shortages of other items like medical grade face masks and other PPE and disinfecting wipes that continue to this day. And the reason for that is that the story here is different. The overall demand for these products has surged significantly during the pandemic. So like toilet paper, these are often low margin products that are typically produced in supply chains optimized for cost and efficiency. That is, they usually have efficient supply chains. And so scaling up production quickly when overall demand increases is not easy to do. There are also typically bottlenecks in the production process. And the bottleneck, very often, it's not the factory building itself or the number of workers in the building, because you can adjust these things easily. You can add tents, you can add workers. Often the bottleneck is a specific step or component in the manufacturing process that requires specialized equipment that's difficult to procure and scale up rapidly. So for example, the melt blown manufacturing process for surgical masks is very specialized, and scaling this up quickly is not cheap or easy given the types of equipment that are required. So I think what we've seen with items that have experienced an overall increase in demand is that most of the time, this is happening with products that also have efficient supply chains. And the surge in demand is quickly exposing the bottlenecks in the production and sourcing process, and that makes it hard to scale production rapidly. And there's not really any alternative production capacity like there is with toilet paper and kind of the business distribution channel to reroute from business to home distribution. You just need to increase overall capacity, and that's a very slow thing to do. Okay, so kind of continuing with this theme, one concern early in the pandemic during the initial period of shortages was whether this event had exposed a fatal flaw in just-in-time or lean production practices. which are often followed in efficient supply chains like the ones I just described. And the concern here is that just-in-time production, which requires firms hold minimal inventory to cut down on cost and instead produce items exactly when they're needed, is just too risky when something like this happens. And it leads to shortages and out-of-stock events as demand surges and links in the supply chain are shut down. So the question is, are lean and just-in-time production going away because of this event? And I think the answer to that is probably not. Lean production is often demonized in the wake of disruptive events, but it saves an enormous amount of money by not having unproductive inventory sitting around. And it's been a huge factor in manufacturing efficiency and quality improvement in the last 50 years, and it's had enormous benefits to society. So I think what will happen instead is that supply chains are going to become more resilient, still following lean principles in the wake of the pandemic. So there are four main ways you can try to insulate disruptions in supply chains. The first of these is holding inventory, right? And this can be expensive, especially if disruptions are rare. If a disruption like a pandemic happens once in 100 years, then 99% of the time you're holding this inventory, you're not going to use it. It's just going to be kind of wasted resources. The second strategy for insulating against disruptions is what can be called pre-disruption diversification. So that means using multiple suppliers located in different areas that can scale up rapidly and let you kind of diversify risk. The third strategy is post-disruption diversification. So this is planning in advance to use a backup supplier in the event of a disruption that you're going to have quick and easy access to. The fourth strategy is to redesign products to use more common components, which lessens the reliance on small quantities of components sourced from single suppliers or any specific components that are in only one product and not another. So after disruptions like we've seen with the pandemic, I think people often focus on the inventory issue, right? That is, you need more inventory to insulate against these kinds of events. But I think the other three strategies for mitigating against risk and making a supply chain more resilient are more likely to happen. So I think what we're going to see is that supply chains become more diversified in sourcing, relying less on parts coming from any one country and more on a mix of different sources. And we'll probably also see some creative things in product design to simplify sourcing and production and make the supply chain more resilient. We've already seen this with things like, going back to the very first example, toilet paper, where we're using kind of less of a variety of different materials in the different products that are being sold in the market and more kind of common components in all of the different variants that are being sold. So you may still, in the end, have to hold inventory for certain components where there's really only a single supplier or where multiple suppliers would be prohibitively expensive. But even Toyota, which is the grandfather of lean production, recognizes the need to be pragmatic about lean production. So that even they hold safety stocks of some critical components, and they kind of increase the geographic diversity of suppliers after the 2011 Japan earthquake. So the previous big disruptive event that happened in supply chains. So that kind of brings me to my next topic, which is, what does COVID mean for the future of global supply chains, right? Is this going to spell the end of global supply chains? And the answer to that is no, I don't think so. My hope and what I think is going to happen is that we will see more diversified supply chains that are less prone to disruption in any one specific area. And this has happened in isolated ways, this increase in diversification in the past, following specific natural disasters like the 2011 Japan earthquake or flooding in Thailand, also in 2011, and so on. So I think now what we're seeing is a global pandemic that can affect literally any part of the planet. And this illustrates that you're not safe from supply chain risk, even if you source in an area free from earthquakes or floods that you think is safe. I think it's likely that this is going to cause a wave of supply chain diversification much bigger than anything we've ever seen before. And hopefully this is going to help companies continue operations as, for instance, the pandemic progresses going on into the fall and the winter of this upcoming year and affects different parts of the world at different times and in different ways. So that's about it for my prepared remarks. I can take some questions now if there are any coming from the chat. Let me go ahead and grab one. I see how are companies using operational expertise to help in the pandemic effort? So that's an interesting question. I think we're seeing a number of companies with great operational expertise do interesting things to support the pandemic effort, like supporting efforts to produce PPE using innovative manufacturing methods such as 3D printing. So a really great example here is GM helping produce badly needed supplies earlier in the pandemic, including things like face shields and ventilators. So GM used 3D printing to help in this effort, but maybe not in the way that you might think they did. So they did not use 3D printing simply to make face shields and ventilators in large volume, just cranking them out on 3D printers, because this would be very slow and very costly. So 3D printing is good at some things, but speed and cost are not two of the things that it's good at. So instead, what they did was use their operational and supply chain expertise to employ a technology like 3D printing in a really intelligent way. So I think they added a lot of value by using their operational expertise effectively. I can give you two examples of that. So for face masks being, or for face shields, which are objects that you can make entirely on a 3D printer, they use 3D printing as a temporary stopgap measure to start generating output right away until they could get a traditional manufacturing line set up to make face shields, right? And so a traditional manufacturing line, once it's up, is going to be much faster, is going to produce much higher volumes, and it's going to do so much more cost effectively, right? So in this sense, they use 3D printing just to start cranking stuff out and get some stuff out there into the environment right away until they could get traditional mass production set up. Another example of something that they did was for ventilators. Ventilators are objects that you cannot make them entirely on a 3D printer. So with these, they use 3D printing instead to help make the dies and the molds of a traditional manufacturing line. So this helped speed up the ramp up of the traditional production process, which could then make ventilators that are badly needed on the front lines, right? So in the end, a company like GM here, which knows a lot about operations, very good at operations, they leverage their own operational expertise and also the strengths of the technology that's available to them, which is 3D printing in this case, to help support the pandemic effort. Next question I'll take is, what long-term changes do you see for the day-to-day operations of companies as a result of the pandemic? So this is a really interesting question. So I think there are multiple long-term changes that we may see in kind of the day-to-day way that companies execute work because of the pandemic. I think the first thing that we may see is increased automation and robotics. For obvious reasons, robots don't get sick and they don't get other people sick. So in that sense, companies in the past, they've taken advantage of some crises like recessions to lay off workers and at the same time increase automation or invest in productivity improving technology. I think in this scenario, we may be seeing some of that right now with the COVID pandemic. Companies that are using the opportunity of the pandemic to invest a little bit more in automation and robotics, both for the safety reason, but also because in the long run, this is a productivity enhancing technology. Another potential long-term change that I think we may see in the day-to-day operations of companies is a move to more kind of remote-friendly operational processes, right? And the reason I think this may be more of a long-term change is that adapting operational processes for partial or full remote work, it's kind of a fixed investment cost that a company has to pay, and it's occurred out of necessity over the past 6 months. That is, companies have already done the hard work figuring out how to do many of their activities with partial or full remote work by many employees. And now that this fixed investment has been made, now that all this hard work has been done, I would not be surprised to see many jobs and activities remain in remote mode even after the pandemic ends. And on top of that, many companies may use what they've learned adapting work for a remote environment for some jobs to continue adapting even more jobs and tasks to be long-term remote in the future. Okay, so I want to, let's see, I'm looking for the next question. I think, okay, another question that I want to address here is, did the US stockpile too few ventilators before the pandemic occurred? So early on in the pandemic, there was a great fear that there were going to be a lack of sufficient ventilators for our hospitals to use in the US, and I think worldwide as well. Now, it appears that we now have enough of these ventilators, and kind of the way that COVID is treated by healthcare providers has been adapted over time to rely a little less on ventilators. So maybe the burden on this resource is a little bit smaller than it had been in the past, or than it was anticipated to be. But I think a great question that we can ask it now is, did we have too few ventilators in the US before the pandemic? Did we plan poorly for an event like this? And I think the answer to that question is kind of a tricky one. One operational challenge with planning for a pandemic ahead of time is this, right? So the effects that we're seeing during a pandemic are so large that the stockpile of products like PPE and ventilators that's going to be required to meet demand and the surge in demand during a pandemic is going to have to be enormous. And holding such a huge stockpile of inventory would be very costly for many reasons. There's the direct financial cost, but there's also the cost of obsolescence and deterioration of the stockpile, right? That is, over time, maybe your PPE, like your masks, your N95 masks and other PPE deteriorates in quality. Maybe it can't be used after a certain number of years. Maybe something like a ventilator, which is somewhat of a high-tech piece of equipment, maybe it becomes obsolete and is no longer cutting edge or state-of-the-art after a certain number of years. And so its value kind of declines over time. Its value during the pandemic is going to decline over time. And on top of that, because these are such rare events, most years you're never going to use that stockpile. So it's just sitting around deteriorating and you've invested a lot of money in it. In such situations, when you have these kind of characteristics, it may not be a good idea to hold a sufficient stockpile in advance for a pandemic. But the key here, and this is important, is that if you don't have a stockpile of this PPE and other equipment, then it's critical to have a plan in place for how you're going to ramp up production quickly if you need to, if a pandemic occurs. So a plan in this case would mean that, for instance, existing manufacturers of PPE and medical equipment have continually updated plans for how to scale rapidly if needed. And also unrelated manufacturers, such as Ford, GM, auto manufacturers, or other manufacturers in other industries, they also have plans in place for how to switch over production to badly needed supplies if needed. Right, so having a plan like this in place, it gives you at least two advantages. The first is that it saves time once the pandemic starts. You already know what you're going to need to do if the pandemic begins and you need these badly needed supplies. And it tells you in advance also how long the ramp up is going to take. And if you know how long the ramp up is going to take, then you can stockpile just enough inventory of critical supplies and equipment to last you until your surge capacity is fully online. So going back to the original question, like, did the US stockpile too few ventilators before the pandemic? I don't truly know the answer to that question, but I think for the next pandemic, understanding, having a plan in place for surge capacity, and then understanding from that what we need in terms of a stockpile just to get us until surge capacity is online, that's going to be a really critical thing to do in planning for the next event like this. Okay, so let me look at a couple of other questions. So first question is, what is the potential for supply chain and manufacturing shifts in case of increased China-US tensions, potentially delaying shipping or increasing costs? Yeah, so I think that obviously there is a lot of potential here. I think these kinds of tensions are not catching companies unawares, and I think that there are, there's some definite plans in place for alternative sources and that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, that's a really difficult question to answer. Of course, a lot of global supply chains flow entirely, or at least in part, through China. And if there are tensions between the China and US, between China and the US, then obviously that could play a significant role here. Next question, how does demand planning now change to incorporate the effects of highly turbulent demand trends? Does demand now remain predictable? I think demand planning is a super fascinating question. Demand planning, both within the pandemic and then for years following the pandemic is going to be a really challenging thing. Right now, demand is not consistent with past data that we've had. So it's very difficult to plan demand. Companies are adapting to that. It's taken some time. I think right now we're seeing companies already anticipating the next surge potentially in COVID cases and stockpiling inventory of critical things that they need to sell just in anticipation of this. So they're anticipating both a surge in demand coming from the future and also potentially limitations in supply. So that's one aspect of this, right? So planning for demand during the pandemic is very significantly different because our past data doesn't really tell us anything. And I think a big challenge also going forward is that even after the pandemic is over, so let's say it's 2021 or 2022, planning for demand in those years is going to be really difficult as well, because you're going to have all this data from the year or longer of the pandemic that doesn't tell you anything about demand in subsequent years. So not only is it hard to plan while you're in the pandemic because your past data doesn't tell you anything, after you get out of the pandemic, the data that you have from the time of the pandemic doesn't tell you anything about future demand as well. So demand planning, I think, is going to be disrupted for multiple years, maybe into 2023 or beyond because of this event. Okay, so I think we have no more questions right now. I've finished my prepared comments. So maybe at this time, it's a good time to wrap up the event. Thank you all for being here. It was a pleasure to talk about operations during a pandemic. I want to alert everyone that next week, Professor Victor Bennett is going to discuss recent research that shows why would-be entrepreneurs give up before they even get started. So thank you all and have a great day.